Hello and good evening, friends. It's so nice to be here with you all. My name is Sarah Freeman-Woolpert. I'm the manager of the Advocacy Teams program at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. And I'm really excited and glad to welcome you all to our April Quaker Changemaker event called War is Not the Answer in Yemen. Before we get started, before I introduce our inspiring panelists, I want to invite my colleague Emma Hulbert to share how we'll gather this evening and some other tech reminders for us. Take it away, Emma.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Hello, everyone. Like Sarah said, my name is Emma Hulbert, and I'm the program assistant for Quaker Outreach at FCNL. And I'll be running technology for this event, so I have a few housekeeping considerations before we get started. First, I see a few of you have been doing this, but I invite you all to say hello in the chat. Share your name, where you're tuning in from, or if you're a part of Meeting Our Church, what Quaker community that is. This is such a great way to, build community virtually, and it's really fun to see who is here in the chat. So we're so glad you're here with us. As you can see, we are recording this event, but the audience will not be included in this recording. Just the speakers will be a part of that. That being said, feel free to turn off your video if you are at all uncomfortable with keeping it on. In addition, captioning is available automatically. That's those words. You see my words showing up at the bottom of your screen. If you don't want to see those captions, you can click on the live transcript option on your Zoom toolbar and click hide subtitles, and that will turn them off on your own computer. We will have some time for you all to ask questions for our amazing panelists towards the end of the event, and we'll do our best to address as many questions as we have time for. We likely won't get to all of them, but we will try. So I invite you to submit your questions in the chat as they come to you throughout the event, and then I will direct them to the panelists. One other thing, if you're calling in on the phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand if you have a question that you would like to ask during our Q&A portion, and I'll unmute you and invite you to ask your question via the telephone then. Finally, just please contact me if you are in need of any sort of Zoom tech support or just any support at all throughout this event. You can private chat me from Zoom's chat bar or email me at ehulbert@fcnl.org, and I will put that in the chat. All right, back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Emma. And again, welcome to all of you who are joining us. So good to see so many familiar faces and a lot of new faces as well. Again, this event is called War is Not the Answer in Yemen. And before we get started, before I kind of introduce everything for the evening, I just wanted to start us off with a moment of grounding silence or a period of worship. If you practice as a Quaker, we just wanted to start off this time with a moment of silence together. So I'll just call us into that and call us out of it. Thank you so much, friends. I'm really looking forward to this conversation with all of you tonight and getting to hear from our guest speakers. Many of you might know me. Again, my name is Sarah Freeman-Woolpert, and I come to this issue and to this work through my role with the advocacy teams at FCNL. Again, some of you might be familiar with this program. I see some team members here. This is a national network of over 125 teams in 44 states around the country, and we lobby on one legislative campaign over the course of each year. This year, we've been advocating to end US support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. And since January, we've done over 150 lobby visits, published over 60 different letters to the editor. This is really an issue that's lit a fire for peace activists all around the country. There are so many amazing folks who are doing this work. And really lifting up the ways that the US is directly complicit and contributing to the war in Yemen, which has been called the forgotten war. And the UN has really described the situation in Yemen as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. So we believe this is extremely important. Tonight, I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with our guest speakers and for many of you to learn more about and dig deeper into this critical issue. So before we begin, I want to just welcome and introduce our two guest speakers, Iman Saleh and Hassan El-Tayyab. I'll take a moment to just share a little bit about their experience and their bios before we start with some of our questions. And we will have some time later in the conversation tonight for folks to ask questions from our speakers in the chat, not verbally, but we'll have a lot of space and time to type questions into the chat that I can ask to our guests here. So Hassan El-Tayyab is FCNL's Legislative Director for Middle East Policy. His passion for foreign affairs is rooted in his desire to make life better for people in the Middle East, including his extended family in Jordan. Hassan is convinced that advancing a more peaceful and diplomacy-based foreign policy in the Middle East is critical not just for the family that he loves, but for peace and stability worldwide. His writings and commentaries, which many of you have probably seen and read before, have been featured in numerous news outlets, including CNN, BBC World, Politico, The Hill, Al Jazeera, Huffington Post, The Intercept, and more. Iman Saleh is the general coordinator of the Yemeni Liberation Movement, a grassroots volunteer-led organization working to end the war in Yemen. She was on a 24-day hunger strike in Washington, D.C. during April in solidarity with the people of Yemen. And her demand for an end to the blockade on Yemen has really brought a huge amount of international and legislative attention to the war. So I'm really, again, grateful just to have both of you here with us tonight. We're looking forward to hearing from you and learning a lot from your experience. We've put together a couple of questions, and I'm going to start off with one of these questions, and then I'm hoping that we can just have a deeper conversation about the work that you both do and how you come into this issue. So to begin, I'd just like to start by asking if each one of you could share how long you've been advocating to end the war in Yemen and how you first got involved in this work. A little about your journey into it. Thank you.
Should I start?
Yes, go ahead.
So thank you, Sarah. That was really great. I have been hearing about the issues happening in Yemen, really even before they started. When I visited Yemen right after, like around 2012, 2013, I was noticing sort of like a brew happening in the country. You know, there was some troubles going on and a lot of talk and concern. But my family really tried to shield me from that when I was visiting my family in Yemen. They were really trying to shield me and just tell me not to worry about it. And they actually still do try to tell me not to worry about Yemen. I'm sorry if you guys see my dog. So around that time, I was just starting college. I didn't have very much time to kind of organize and work on the issues that are passionate to me now. But when I graduated in 2019, and then around 2020, the pandemic happened, and I started getting a lot more time to be able to organize. And I was really moved and really inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement and just Black organizing in general, and how that resonates with not just issues here in the United States, you know, being against state violence and state authority, but also how those issues relate to a lot of the issues in the global South back home. You know, settler violence and military violence are all rooted in the same, in the same machine. So being able to find space and knowledge in those during that time, especially around 2020, I've been organizing just here and there, mostly for Palestine before then, but then in 2020, I was able to kind of find just leadership through Hassan, through folks like Dr. Aisha at Yemen Relief Foundation, Dr. Shadeen, who is an incredible scholar and organizer as well. And so, you know, just being in that community and learning more about what was happening in Yemen, not just through my family who are living through these issues that we talk about here, that we have the privilege to talk about here, but being able to understand how the US in particular has a role in that, that maybe my family overseas may not understand. And so coming into this work has had its ups and downs, but I'm so grateful I've been able to finally find my way back into Yemen, and my role in that.
Thank you. Hassan, let's go to you.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I know so many of you, I recognize so many of you are already knee deep in this activism. Iman inspired me and the entire peace movement last year. She continues to do that, but especially last year with her hunger strike for to end the Saudi blockade on Yemen. And there was an amazing op-ed she wrote in the Washington Post, and I am just, honored to be on this panel with her. So, how did I get here? That's a great question. It's been kind of a roundabout journey. I was a full-time musician, now turned person that wears ties in Capitol Hill. I don't know how this happened, but here's a little window into how I got here. My name translated into Arabic actually means beautiful. I don't know if folks know that, but it also meant that I'd be the target of a lot of racism and hate growing up in the United States. I'm used to having to get to airports a little bit early, having people mispronounce my name. Sarah did a fantastic job, by the way. Thank you for that. And having people assume things about me that just aren't true. My freshman year of college, I saw the tragic events of 9/11 unfold from a TV in my college dorm room. I was horrified by the war that resulted from that, horrified by the attacks on 9/11, an attack that was actually, put my dad at risk because he works in New York City. So people were giving me a hard time for that. And I said, hey, aren't we all Americans here? And I just didn't understand that. But I, looked at how our military was being used in the Middle East to attack people like my, people that looked and sounded, and spoke like my family. So peace activism seemed like a good place to get involved in that work. So I put down the guitar doing the full-time music thing, and I still play a lot though, by the way. I still jam a lot and love that, but I've started doing a lot more political organizing. I started in Chicago at the Chicago Area Peace Action, and I did a bunch of work trying to get folks in the community to care about Yemen, care about the War Powers Resolution. And then I met someone Iman just referenced, Shireen Al-Ademi, who really opened my eyes up to U.S. complicity. And there are a ton of horrible, horrible situations in the world. But there aren't too many situations where the U.S. can play a role to end the war in this kind of way, because we are literally giving the bombs, the maintenance, spare parts, and the logistical support to these warplanes as they're bombing civilians. So it seemed like, wow, there's a lot of bad things going on. This is something that I can do to make a difference. I got a lobbying contract with Just Foreign Policy, bought my first suit, drove in my Chrysler Voyager to Washington, D.C., and I've been rocking this ever since, and was so grateful to meet Friends Committee on National Legislation, and now I'm working with you all across the country. Thank you both so much.
I always love to see how these different paths kind of intersect and the different ways. I was really inspired to hear the different kind of paths that each of you took into this work. And I wonder if we could zoom out a little bit for those on this call who may be less familiar with the situation in Yemen, with the war. I wonder if you could each tell us briefly a little bit of information about how the war started, the current situation in Yemen, just so that folks might have a little bit more context for those of us who haven't been working on this for as long as you both have.
Sure. Would you like me to
go ahead? Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Sure. So Yemen's political instability began after a 2011 Arab Spring uprising that ousted then President Saleh, who had been in power for several decades. At the time, Vice President Hadi, he became Yemen's interim president for what was supposed to be a 2-year term, and during a transition to a more representative form of government with regular elections. In 2015, with the stated goal of restoring Hadi to power, Saudi Arabia joined forces with the United Arab Emirates with the backing of the U.S., UK, France, Canada, and others, and started to attack Yemen through Operation Decisive Storm. They pummeled the country, to oust the Houthis who had taken over the capital of Sana'a, and we've seen a 7-year war, now in its 8th year, drag on, which has caused the world's worst humanitarian crisis. 80% of the population depends on food assistance for survival. We've got almost 500,000 people that have died as a result of this war, in part because of the airstrikes, but also restrictions on humanitarian aid, commercial goods like food, fuel, and medicine. So it has just been an absolute humanitarian nightmare. So the war in Ukraine obviously has exacerbated situations all over the world. But in Yemen, they rely heavily on Ukrainian wheat, 27% to be exact, and 8% of wheat from Russia. So this is pushing famine beyond the brink here. The Saudi blockade is a real driver in this humanitarian suffering. They've cut off the continuous flow of all these commercial goods. And without food, fuel, and medicine, without fuel, food and medicine can't be transported easily throughout the country. And so you often don't have enough medical access for people. In February 2021, President Biden announced an end to U.S. support for the war, but didn't really define what that meant, what's offensive, what's defensive. And we later learned that this spare parts and maintenance is ongoing. So, obviously we're still deeply complicit. Just briefly, as I wrap up and hand it over to Iman, we really welcome news. I don't know, I'm sure folks maybe have seen the news that there's a Ramadan peace starting April 1, which is fantastic news for people that want peace in Yemen. The deal was basically to halt military operations. For the most part, the Saudi bombings have stopped, which is fantastic. The Houthis have not done these cross-border attacks into Abu Dhabi, into the UAE, or into Saudi. So, that violence has stopped. We haven't seen the blockade completely lifted, but they've allowed several fuel ships in, and they just made a plan to open up flights from Sana'a Airport just in the next 3-4 days. So really good news, that we might be seeing an end to this. And I'll maybe hand it over to Iman if she wants to say more. But this is a very unique moment in the war to be having this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, there's really not much more I can add to Hassan's great summary of what's happening. The only thing I feel like might help even to put it in perspective is if we just broaden out a little bit, and outside of the question of how did this war start in Yemen, and talk about like how regularly the United States is involved in wars globally, not just in Yemen. And how willingly it is to jump right into a conflict, especially when it comes to countries in the global south, and especially when it comes to countries that are unable to defend themselves, like Yemen. So Yemen was a prime target after the uprising, and after working towards its own legislative process for democracy, working towards its own self-determination is what I like to call, and the words I like to always use is Yemen has its own right to self-determination. And really no country should ever be involved when it comes to its own people trying to build a future for themselves. Just try to imagine if, for example, if the United States is currently dealing with a major racial issue, always has been dealing with a major racial issue. But if we try to imagine like what would happen if, China just came in and just stomped its feet on our grounds and just said, we're going to handle this for you from now on. It's a wild perspective. And since the inception of the United States, 240 plus years ago, through its violence of settler colonialism and colonization and raping and pillaging and killing indigenous peoples, the United States has stayed in that that violence, in that route of war and violence for 92% of its lifetime. So for 92% of the United States has been alive, it's been at war with something or someone, and that should be just a huge major red flag for every single citizen living here. Like, what is our tax dollars going to? Why is our military budget constantly increasing by billions? And we like to call, in the organizing world, we call this the military industrial complex, because the US is such a huge major war machine that bullies all these other countries. And so just for everybody to put in perspective, this is kind of the work that we like to do and talk about. And it's not a case by case basis. It's not just Iraq, it's not just Yemen or Syria, Palestine. It's really just in the nature, in the blood, in the fabric of America, and the truth does hurt sometimes.
Yeah. Thank you, Iman. And thank you both for kind of zooming out on this. I think that there are so many much larger systemic issues of racism and the military industrial complex that are wrapped up in our conversations around Yemen. And so I appreciate you bringing in that perspective so that we're not just looking at, the one piece that we're focused on, but seeing how we're part of this much broader movement, I think. And that transitions me into the next question, which is around the specific actions and roles you've each been taking on in this work. So one of the things that I always think is really interesting and inspiring is to learn more about the different roles that each person or each group can play in a much broader movement. And I know that each one of you has really specific expertise and different actions that you've been leading on, different tactics that you've been working on. So I wonder if each one of you could speak a little bit about the work that you've been doing to organize both at the local and national levels, for folks here who, again, may not know as much about some of your backgrounds. So let's go first, maybe back to Iman.
Yeah. So, since being in the Yemeni liberation movement, and we've entered in many spaces that we've been able to connect and work in together. And so when last year, through the support of like the local Detroit, specifically Detroit organizations, which, by the way, Detroit has one of the most incredible grassroots movement, workers' rights spaces, cities, and I think in so many places, because Detroit is such a blue collar city. But since talking and organizing about ways that other organizations could help in peace efforts towards Yemen, we as the YLM decided that maybe the best way to show solidarity and gain gain awareness for what was happening in Yemen was through a hunger strike. And so around this time last year, we went to Washington, D.C. To basically just protest on the doorsteps of the big man of the White House. And we were there for a little over 25 days. And we basically just hunger striked, was drumming in front of the White House. We connected with so many organizations there who, the indigenous Black organizations, Filipino organizations that resonated with the message that we had. So we were able to sort of galvanize this local movement, this youth and general movement for people who wanted to not only, who were also learning with us as well what was happening in Yemen, but joining that movement and continue to join that movement with us today through the grassroots level. So we wanted to really focus on our work outside of outside of just nonprofit organizations, because we felt that there was a major hole for Yemen organizing within the grassroots level, within the volunteer level, within the youth level. So we tapped into that and used the power of social media to harness and galvanize communities, not just in DC and in Detroit, but also just nationally and internationally. And we've reached out to many, many, many news outlets. And even though we were able to get something in the Washington Post, it's actually one of the things that we were very, very disappointed in was the lack of coverage when we were reaching out to other news publications that weren't interested in what was happening in Yemen, weren't interested in the hunger strike, or really anything what we had to say about Yemen. But now all of these news outlets are happily reporting on what's happening in Ukraine. And so, like talking about where we are as an American society and how we're supporting these wars, and what we can also do to end that support or hold our legislative officials accountable as well. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right, Hassan, let's hear more about your role specifically. Thanks.
Yeah, it takes all kinds of change makers. I gotta say, this has been truly a tapestry of tactics, and I'm just really happy to be a part of it in some small way. Now, I would say my tactics, you all, we're doing a whole bunch of stuff here. So part of my tactic is to actually work with all of you to get you all to lobby your members of Congress. I think that's a role that I've been trying to play and really mobilize the peace movement at large to take on Yemen as a top priority. So I'm happy to report that we just sent a 68 org coalition, national organizations. Iman's group, Yemeni Liberation Movement, was one of them. And we sent that to every congressional office on Capitol Hill. And I'm really excited that we've built up so much momentum at the national level and at the grassroots level to kind of move the conversation forward. I'll also add, one unique piece of this puzzle has been the Republican outreach. When I first got to DC, and still a little bit confused about how it's like that movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It's how I felt. I'm like, hey everybody, is this thing on? And but one of the first things I was doing was actually working with Republicans. I did 40 congressional lobby visits with Colonel Larry Wilkerson, who is Colin Powell's chief of staff, and I didn't know who this guy was before. I knew who Colin Powell was, but he and we mobilized Freedom Works, Defense Priorities, In Defense of Christians. That's a hard right evangelical organization that Mike Pence is their annual speaker. So if so these were the folks that we mobilized, and we lobbied 40 Republican offices, the whole Freedom Caucus, and we were able to get about 20 plus of them to support the WPR under Trump. And that was a really critical thing to do, I think, because without their support, we wouldn't have passed this. WPR is War Powers Resolution. Forgive me, I'm an alphabet soup over here. That's one thing I did learn in the past 5 years since I've been on the Hill, is all these little acronyms. But anyway, I think this Republican support and this Republican strategy has been really interesting. And when I got to FCNL, you all know better than anybody that the spirit is in all people. And that's something that has really resonated with me and really, helped me think about advocacy in a whole new way. So I'm very grateful to the FCNL community for, instilling these values. I kind of got it, but I really got it once I moved over here, is that we might not agree on everything, but at the very least, I'm going to approach you in good faith, try to build a longer term relationship, assume that you have good intentions. And, regardless if you're on TV talking about, whatever you're talking about on Fox News, or CNN or anywhere, that maybe we can come together on this issue, this unauthorized Saudi-led war and blockade on Yemen. And it's turned out to be that we have a majority in the Republicans, a majority of Republicans, Democrats coming together that can get this over the finish line. I'll also say that the American people, when polled, we got 60% of Republicans support cutting off weapons to Saudi Arabia. We've got 60% of Democratic voters that support cutting off the support. So that's definitely, I think, one of my main takeaways is sort of, you know, trying to break down some of these artificial barriers that the media industrial complex has really created for you know, our consciousness here in you know, in the United States, and realize that we have a lot more in common than we might think.
Thanks, Hassan. This is kind of perfectly transitions us into my last question before we turn to some audience questions, which I see there are many of in the chat already. So if you have a question that you want to ask our panelists, please feel free to type it in the chat. But you talked about values and, you know, working at FCNL and sort of how you ground yourself in these values. And of course, as a Quaker organization, we really approach lobbying and advocacy through this perspective of trying to identify kind of common ground or shared values and to build on that. And I wonder if each one of you could just speak in a little bit more depth to the deeper, more deeply held values that you bring into this work that really inspire and motivate you to, in your advocacy to end the US support for the war in Yemen, that some of the values that really bring you here and keep you going in this work.
Well, yeah, if I could take this one. I told you one of them already in my last answer, is that, you know, that there is good in everybody. We just got to find it and see if we can, you know, work together and bring them on board. So I think that's a guiding philosophy I have through this work. Another thing that I believe firmly is that human life has value everywhere. Children in Yemen have the same value, you know, as children in Ukraine, in Palestine, in Gaza, in Jordan, where my family's from, in Europe, in Baltimore, right here, in public schools in DC. And this is a universal principle. And I don't think we should be, you know, and so I try to put myself in their shoes. If, you know, you know, my government right now is bombing these children in Yemen. And so why wouldn't I want to do something to help support them in their struggle and try to end US support for this horrible war? And, you know, I just, it also, you know, comes home a lot for me when, you know, my family is in the Middle East. I had a cousin that was actually, you know, his name's Muath. In 2015, he flew a plane into Syria. And his plane malfunctioned. He crashed in Syria and he was burned alive in a cage by ISIS. And this to me was sort of like just this deep sense of wrong. I knew there was something wrong, like during 9/11 when people were being really racist and, you know, making fun of my name, and we were going into Iraq. But this experience I had with, you know, this extremist group really, you know, coming to power in the vacuum that the United States created, and then my family is directly being impacted by that, it became, you know, beyond the pale, and I was spurred to action. And then, you know, I've been kind of doing it ever since. And I will say that I'm really just excited that over time, our movement has just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. This is one of 3 Yemen webinars. Granted, don't tell the other ones, but this is going to be my favorite one. But we're doing one with Peace Action tomorrow. We did one with Code Pink yesterday. And we're talking hundreds of people are coming out to these events. So just really inspiring that, you know, we're not alone anymore and that we have so many people that are our allies.
Yeah, Hassan, you really hit it on the nose. I remember when you told me that story about your cousin, and just how incredibly painful that is when you're seeing family, or you just even trying, like, imagining what your family has gone through in those last moments. I find myself thinking about that when it comes to my family in Yemen. But you know, a lot of the work that I think I can agree that you and I both do, isn't just rooted like in any particular political agenda or anything to do with recognition or just following this sort of path of peace. It's more than that. It's really just a deep sense of humanity, just of full understanding or having sympathy towards seeing not just our families by blood, but also just our families by nature, by through oppression in these communities, who have really never been able to see sort of like this light at the end of the tunnel because they've been suffering for so long. And a lot of these, I think about a lot of the children who are born in Yemen today, and who have been born in Yemen for the last 7 years, how they've only ever known war, if they've been able to live through it, and if they've been able to be healthy through it, which the odds are is that they haven't been able to do that. And so I look at I look at these communities and specifically children. I don't know, I don't have any children of my own, but I've always sort of had this maternal instinct towards them, and seeing them in Palestine, in the Philippines, and in the Ukraine, and Syria, Iraq, and all of these places that have just known suffering for so long at the hands of the United States. I'm not, I like to say that I'm more of a spiritual person and not just a religious person. I follow so many ideas from many different origins, but I am fasting. I'm currently fasting now, but I am fasting for the month of Ramadan. And going into it, I really wanted to hone in on on being humble, because I realize that there is a massive amount of privilege being able to live here, and having a voice that you can use within the belly of the beast. And so this year, I really wanted to make my intentions of being humble and sort of rerouting back to my roots, and back to fulfilling those ideas and those morals and values that I so deeply value. And what I can do, even, as one person in Detroit, who I can talk, like, who can I talk to? Who can I galvanize? And how can I use my voice in the best way that I can, in contributing to those peace efforts in Yemen.
Thank you. And yeah, thank you both so much. I just think the values grounding that you bring into this, personal experiences, different ways that you kind of keep yourself going in this work, and remember kind of what's really important that you're fighting for, to me is really inspiring. So thank you both for sharing that. We have some time now for questions from folks in the audience to type into the chat. We have a lot of questions, and which is often the case. Especially, I know that folks are really interested and passionate about this work that you're doing. So I'll just start with one question, and then whichever one of you wants to answer first, we can go with whoever feels most comfortable and make this more of a discussion. So this is from Dolphin State College Friends, who asked, who or what was influential in bringing about the current ceasefire in Yemen? Are there any particular leaders, or what were some of the factors that you would see as really important to understand what's going on right now with the truce?
Maybe I could take a stab and let Iman follow up. There's definitely a lot of factors going on here. The truce just didn't happen out of nowhere. I would just highlight one. We had Jayapal and DeFazio, Bernie Sanders, and Ro Khanna on the 25th of March threaten a Yemen war powers resolution in a public statement. And then we saw the warring parties and Saudi Arabia, rapidly push for this truce agreement. And it was, it started April 1. I think that's a huge part of this, is that when Congress reasserts itself, the warring parties, and especially Saudi Arabia, knows that they cannot support this war effort without the daily flow of spare parts, maintenance, logistical support, and weapon sales. So they might be, pushing Biden around here to pump more oil. Unfortunately, the administration is letting that kind of behavior go. But Congress is the backstop here. They can reassert their Article 1 war power. So I think that's a huge piece of it. A couple other things I'll just mention. The other big piece is that the Houthis have really advanced their technology and are now striking into deeper territories. So Abu Dhabi, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, no value judgment here, but they've increased the threat for both the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And I think this is an incentive for both those countries to try to resolve this crisis, which is now spilling into their, it's impacting their city centers in a very real way. Mohammed bin Salman has the Vision 2030, where he wants all this investment to come to Saudi Arabia. It's not going to happen. It might not happen anyway, but it's definitely not going to happen if people are feeling like rocket attacks are going to be coming into their territory and disrupting business and making people scared. So that's another huge piece. Last but not least, we have some progress on the Iran nuclear deal. And the Biden administration, I don't agree with a lot of things they're doing, but they are making some progress here with this Iran nuclear deal negotiation to get back into the JCPOA. And I think that thawing of relations there could play a positive role. We don't know where the JCPOA talks are going. The IRGC listing of the foreign terror listing of the IRGC, which is the Revolutionary Guard in Iran. That's the sticking point right now. But I do think that these ongoing negotiations are opening some space for this truce agreement. But if Iman has more, please.
I don't have anything more to add to that, but I wondered, Sarah, if I was just able to address something that I just saw in the chat, or should I just wait until you get to that?
I think, if you want to share something based on, there's a lot of questions flying in the chat and we probably won't have time to get to all of them, but feel free if you want to just mention something that came up.
I just wanted, it's not I'm not going to answer any particular question that I saw. It was just addressing this, like the sentiment around the Houthis. And I just really want to make it very, very clear that me as an individual and even as the Yemeni Liberation Movement, we don't support any political sides in this conflict. We only address the United States role in this. So I just want to make that very, very clear. But what I do get frustrated in this work is people's constant barrage of what about the Houthis? What about the Houthis? And I just really want to make sure that before anybody asks a question about the Houthis, how is that rooted in your consumption of media, and where are those? Where is that media being funneled from? Where is that sort of that propaganda coming from? Because when we met with Tim Lenderking, who's the U.S. Special Envoy to Yemen last year, one of his staffers also brought up the same kind of BS, excuse my language, which is, the Houthis have been this and that. And I asked her to pull up a sort of a civilian death toll in comparison to Yemeni civilians who've died at the hands of Saudi Arabia versus Saudi civilians who have died at the hands of Houthi, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, Hassan, but it's zero. And I really just want the audience to know to backtrack your thoughts of Houthis and focus that energy first on how the United States, this giant Goliath, and how they're using the message of the Houthis to distract you and to pull you away from holding the United States accountable, to instead blaming it on some other organization on the other side of the world who has nowhere near as the same caliber of weapons and death toll as the United States and as Saudi and the UAE as well. So just wanted to address that. I know that's not the same as question, but we can definitely jump back into the question.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And I'm I'm actually thinking I might draw on that question a little bit and then position this to Hassan too, which is, I know the advocacy teams across the country going in and talking to congressional staff, members of Congress. A lot of times there's pushback that I know you both hear in your work. That's kind of, what about the Houthis? What about the role of Iran? These other, sort of talking points that people hear a lot. And I wonder if, Hassan, if you could also speak to this, which is kind of what are some of the misconceptions or some of the pushback that you hear when you're really asking people to support a war powers resolution, asking members of Congress to come on and state their support to end US support for this war, and how are those misconceptions really important for us to be working to correct or to make sure the information is accurate that people are hearing about this conflict?
Thanks, Sarah. I have heard it all. I have heard it all. I'm telling you, Iran is the real problem. If we don't support the Saudis, it's going to be, just the sky is going to fall. We can't use the war powers resolution for what we're trying to use it for. You hear a lot, but just to address, and a lot of it, I try not to take it personal. Because a lot of what you're hearing, they're filtering it through, like picking at all these little details, but there could be whole other different reasons and considerations for why they're telling you what they're telling you. So that's something I have learned, where the boss might be in a tough election, and there is a contractor in district who is giving lots of campaign donations to the opponent. It could be that simple. The tentacles of this industrial complex go far and wide. So there's a lot of money to be made, and if they by doing what we're asking them to do, billions and billions and billions of dollars are on the line. Shareholder stock value is on the line. But what we have on our side here is that the American people broadly support this policy. Like I was saying before, we've got robust bipartisan majorities that have already voted for this. We've got the American people, when polled, they want this. A lot of people are, Mohammed bin Salman, wasn't he the guy that assassinated Jamal Khashoggi? So, the American people get it, but trying to move this political needle is really hard. One lesson I've learned is that when we do things in public, we win. That is something I've seen this all across the board. We just won. We got a majority in the House, 219 representatives, bipartisan majority, voted to terminate spare parts, logistical support, intelligence sharing, and this maintenance that's ongoing in the National Defense Authorization Act last year. On Iran's involvement, we do hear that, hey, and I'm against all weapon sales here. I don't want it to come from Iran, Saudi, UAE, France, Canada, you name it. So I'm against it all. But, Iran's support for the Houthis is often exaggerated. Iran spends far less than the hundreds of billions Saudi spends annually backing the Houthi forces. A significant portion of that Houthi weaponry is actually, generated locally by defeating Saudi-backed forces, looting army stockpiles, taking weapons from militias, purchasing on the black market. But what I always tell these offices, I'm like, on its own terms, the strategy has failed. 7 years of indiscriminate airstrikes, blockade by Saudi, in their attempts to isolate the Houthis and avoid what I would say good faith diplomacy, have really only emboldened the Houthis, increased Iran's involvement in the war. The Houthis now govern 80% of the country's population and are now closer to Iran than before the war. So Saudi Arabia's policy, this is what I tell some of the hawks, is like, on its own terms, it's failing. The driver is drunk and you keep handing them the keys. It's time to stop handing them the keys, because clearly they are not accountable and not behaving well. And their stated policy objectives cannot be achieved through a military solution, only by lifting the blockade, ending these airstrikes. And we got some momentum here. We got to keep it going. You know, really happy that Reps Jayapal and DeFazio and so many in our network are working to support this cutoff of this military aid to the coalition. Hopefully we can turn this 2-month truce into a 4-month truce, into a lasting peace deal. Iman and I are going to get coffee in Old Sana someday, and I cannot wait. I hope that day is soon.
Also, just for everybody to kind of get an idea how frustrating it's really been over the last 7 years. This is an illegal war, and in my standards, really every war is an illegal war. But in this current situation right now, this is actually an illegal, unauthorized war. Meaning that it really should never happened in the first place. The United States really should not have had any hand in this in the first place, and yet for some reason it has been so hard to push for an end to it, and that really should be alarming for so many people, that the United States government is not held accountable by its own people. It can just like that, just start a war, and just like that, it could end it, you know, in just a matter of a few words. It could, Biden could just say no more, and we would be done. It's that simple. And I think that's one of the very frustrating things about, you know, the United States role in this.
Thank you both. We have what I thought was a really good question in the chat that I want to make sure we get time to speak about, which was from Murray Bwanji. And Murray asked, or said, the contrasting responses to the war in Ukraine compared to other US supported wars elsewhere really lays bare the connection between racism, colonialism, and greed, whether that's related to oil, the weapons industry, you name it. And she asked, have you done intersectional advocacy with other groups who are working on those other issues? Or what are some of the ways that either one of you, I know both of you have done a lot of really important and inspiring coalition work with other folks in this movement. Could you speak to that a little bit about how you've brought that perspective in?
Yeah, that's actually a really great, yeah, that's a really great thought you brought up, because it is something that a lot of us have been talking about. And although we absolutely recognize that everything that's happening in the Ukraine is horrific and very, very sad, we feel for those brothers and sisters in the Ukraine. I mean, it's absolutely horrible. And then there's also, you know, right now, for example, what's happening in Palestine. People can't even pray and fast without being killed, without being tear gassed in a place of worship, you know, and yet there's complete silence from the world. And a lot of it is, you know, like Murray said, rooted in colonialism and racism and greed. And how that and how we sort of view these issues too makes a huge difference in how we talk about it as well. And so like the way that we look at, for example, the Middle East, is that this is just one big ball of conflict that we don't, that is just too complicated for us to deal with. It's been going on forever. We really don't have any kind of say, or don't really have any kind of power to change that. Or, you know, for example, what's you know, everything, the colonialism happening in Africa, you know, like, oh, well, they're better off with, you know, the support from France, or from the British and the colonialism that happened there, and the reparations that they deserve as well. So yes, we do talk a lot about these issues, not only on a local level, but how Hassan said, the tentacles of the military-industrial complex are very far and wide, and whatever you see happening on a local level is an extension to the international level. And for example, even in the Philippines, where the United States supplies, you know, I believe it's in the millions or the billions. I'm having trouble remembering, but they also, the government in the Philippines attacking its own citizens is receiving weapons support from the United States as well. And these are people who are dealing with a mass of issues, and the last thing that they need is all of their money being dumped into killing its own people. You look at the issues in Kashmir. Kashmir is one of the most biggest prisons in the world, along with Gaza in Palestine as well. The people in Kashmir have dealt with tens of thousands of human disappearances from the military of India. And yeah, like these are all issues rooted in settler colonialism and colonialism, as well as the military industrial complex, and just really capitalism, the way that we are profiting off of these wars, and how we're able to live so comfortably here is how we're able to is at the death and the blood of people overseas. And I actually wanted to just quickly say that somebody had brought up to me how even while gas at the time was, I believe, a little $4 and plus in many other states, how that itself, if you look at it in the perspective, how that even by itself is actually considered cheap, because we're digging up millions and millions and millions of years old, basically dinosaur bones. That's actually by itself not cheap. But the way that we're able to bring it here cheap is through the death and the bloodshed of people in these oppressed communities. The way that we're able to afford it at $2-3 a gallon is through the bloodshed, through the war. So I just wanted to put that in perspective for the audience.
Thanks, Iman. Sarah, I don't know if you want me to, if there's time for me to give a quick.
You got it.
You know, the war in Ukraine has taught America the victim side of a conflict. I think this is something that I don't know if the United States has seen in decades, you know, what it's like to be on the victim side of this conflict, refugees, and, you know, I'm hopeful that we can extend that empathy to victims of war everywhere. So that I really think that now is a perfect moment for us to be talking about Yemen and really changing the channel back to something that, you know, we are complicit in, something that we can solve. I'll also say, speaking of intersectionality, I love this word when it's used as a verb, not a noun. You know, I like, you know, I like nouns too, but verbs are I prefer verbs, because that means we're going to get into action. We're not just going to like say that all these issues are connected, but do something about it. So me and the climate lobbyists here at FCNL, we partnered on a coalition statement. We're getting a Noah's Ark style, same number of climate groups, same number of foreign policy groups, and saying, Biden, don't go hat in hand to Saudi Arabia, you know, and to get them to produce more fossil fuels, because look at their human rights record in Yemen, and also look at the IPCC report that says that our country is frying. Our nation, our world is literally, you know, not in a good shape as a result of fossil fuel emissions. So we have to urgently, you know, not produce more fossil fuels from, you know, authoritarian petrostates like Saudi Arabia, but use things like the Defense Production Act to double down on our transition to renewable and do a just transition to make sure we're not leaving a bunch of people behind either. So I'll pass it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Hassan, and thank you, Iman, as well. Just in time for Earth Day tomorrow, kind of a perfect note for us to transition to our closing. Before we go into kind of our final takeaways, actions that folks in the audience can take, of course, we hope that you'll connect with FCNL, with the advocacy teams, and support Iman's work as well. We'll share some links. But I just wanted to ask each one of you in like 30 seconds or less, you know, this is a moment where there's a temporary truce in Yemen. We're seeing, you know, the first period without airstrikes, 2 weeks without airstrikes for the first time, I think, in over 7 years. What is something that's making you feel hopeful right now for the future of this situation, for the future of Yemen? And we don't have a lot of time left, but I just wanted us to be able to end on that note, because it feels like this is a moment with so much possibility. So,
well, this kind of work certainly doesn't always leave you hopeful. This work is very exhausting, very tiring, and can really bring you down on many occasions. But having, being able to have a community of people who are doing the same work and uplifting each other has really been has really truly been a God's blessing. And also I, you know, having this happening in the month of Ramadan has really been able to put it in perspective, and sort of just kind of going back to my roots and understanding my ancestry and how proud they would be for sort of fighting for this justice, and looking forward towards a better future, whether I live for it or not. I just know that at least I use my time on this earth towards working for that. So
Thank you. You know, I would just say that I'm inspired by Iman Saleh over here, who put it all on the line in DC. I did my best to comfort her. I think I brought my guitar out one time, and but that kind of activism and dedication to this cause, it's something I want to support. And those are the people that I want to keep in my life. Aman is gonna, whether she likes it or not, is gonna be a friend of mine for a long time. I'm hoping. And that kind of community and solidarity really gives me hope. And also the fact that we've been doing it, we've been sticking it out, but we've got something to show for it. We've got a truce in Yemen. We've got, an end to Saudi bombings for, the past, 20 days. I think that's something to really be proud of. And I think the work that we're doing here in the US, not just working with these amazing people like Iman, but also with Sarah. She doesn't get enough credit. She's doing incredible work, keeping us all on track here with our lobbying, and all of you, the advocacy teams across the country, who are not just inspiring each other and me, but inspiring other peace groups around the country. And, this is really an awesome moment. I'm so happy to be here with all of you, and let's keep it going. We're not stopping.
Hassan has always remained the most amazing optimist in our friendship. And by the way, he has amazing music. He's on Spotify. His music did indeed bring me a lot of peace. So definitely he deserves credit for so many things, and his music is one of them.
Thank you. And thank you again both so much. Thank you, Iman. Thank you, Hassan, for being here with us and taking the time to speak with us tonight. I know that we're a couple minutes over. It's far worth it to be here and to hear from these amazing speakers. And I just really appreciate and want to lift up all the amazing work you both are doing. It's difficult work, and I know it takes a lot to stick with it and to be doing this day in, day out. But I know that folks here on this call, FCNL staff and others, just really draw so much inspiration from the work that you all are doing. And we want to be able to be there to show up and to support you. So thank you again so much. With that, I think I'm going to turn things over to Emma to wrap us up and share a couple of takeaways, ways that you can take action with us going forward. And thank you again so much to our speakers. So take it away, Emma.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah and Iman and Hassan. That was incredible. Before we conclude our discussion for the evening, I just want to make sure you all know about a few things. First, if you are inspired by tonight's discussion and want to take action, we have an action alert for you on our website. Just put that in the chat there. In addition, we mentioned advocacy teams a lot this evening. If you're at all interested in getting involved or lobbying with one locally, you can read more about them and connect with them here. And then Iman shared this call for art for an upcoming show on building community, building power, art as resistance. And you can learn more about that amazing project at this link. I apologize for all the links. I promise they're all worth it. And finally, I would just flag that our May Quaker Changemaker event is going to be Seeking Truth, Healing, and Right Relationship, Quakers and the Legacy of Indian Boarding Schools. And this will take place on May 25th at 6:30 p.m. Eastern. So just stay tuned to register. I'm really excited about it. With that, just thank you all so much for joining this Quaker Changemaker event. I learned so much. This was really incredible. Thank you so much to our amazing panelists, Hassan and Iman, and Sarah for moderating. Have a great night, everyone. And I hope to see you next month.
Good night, y'all.
Good night.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night.